Hello, good evening, and welcome to this press conference being held by the Prime Minister's office. Welcome to the members of the public, those both viewing from CBC Channel 8 and viewing online. With us this afternoon, we have the Prime Minister of Barbados, the Honorable Mia Amor-Motley, and she's joined by members of Cabinet. We also have present with us members of the media who, following the presentations and briefing to the nation, will engage the Prime Minister. So without further ado, I turn it over to the Prime Minister. PM.
Thank you very much, Alex. First of all, members of the press, members of the Barbadian public, let me start this briefing by first of all extending personally, yet again, my own condolences to the family of Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, our fourth Prime Minister, who regrettably passed away earlier this week. I think that Barbadians across, not just those in the country, but across the world, have also started to express their condolences to the family. And please be aware that Cabinet, at its closure just now, would also have observed a minute's silence as a matter of respect for the fourth Prime Minister. In fact, when you walk in normally to where we meet, you would see his picture there, and therefore we are reminded weekly of his contribution to this nation as Prime Minister between 1987 and 1994, but also are aware that before being Prime Minister, he made a substantive contribution at different levels in Barbados. I would have hoped to have addressed you yesterday when I landed, but obviously because the nation was still in official mourning, we took the decision to wait to today to give you an update as to where we were. The day that I left on the last occasion, I would have indicated what I was going to do, and I therefore deem it appropriate for us to be able to report what we have been able to do over the course of the last 2 weeks. It was long and arduous, but I believe rewarding and satisfactory for the benefit of the country. Our first engagement was, in fact, with the British Ministry of Foreign and Commonwealth Office. They invited me to address all of their ambassadors and high commissioners, particularly on the Bridgetown Initiative. And I'm happy to report that as early as this morning, the Foreign Secretary sent me a speech where he explicitly, and I don't want to mislead anyone, where he explicitly referred to the Bridgetown Initiative and to make the point that the British government is supporting the Bridgetown Initiative, that in addition they believe the need to reinvigorate multilateralism, which is critical for us. Having gone through COVID, we know what it is to have to fight out there as a small state in what I used to call in this room the wild, wild, wild west, where people place export restrictions on equipment and all of the things that we needed when we were in our darkest hour of need simply were not there. These are some of the things that have inspired us to better prepare for the challenges. 70% of the challenges we face in this country are really fueled from challenges that are outside of our borders, from the climate crisis to the pandemic to issues relating to the price of energy, oil prices and gas prices in particular, to the disruption of the supply chain, which also had a corresponding increase with respect to pricing. Many of these things lie outside of our reach, and therefore having a strong voice internationally is critical to being able to defend what we need defending, and to have the elbow room. You see me do this all the time, the elbow room to be able to make the decisions to protect our citizens against those headwinds. In addition, he would also have supported the need to stretch the balance sheet. Multilateral development banks, there's not enough money out there. If we have to borrow in order to be able to prepare ourselves for the future, because every dollar spent in building resilience, we avoid $6 to $7 in damage, and not to mention a loss of life, for which there is no financial amount that can be placed. So that meeting went exceptionally well, and we also would have visited His Majesty with respect that same afternoon for an exhibition for the Windrush generation, the 75th anniversary. Many of us may be aware that the Windrush event is where West Indians went in their numbers, 1948, to be able to help rebuild the United Kingdom after World War II. And the question as to how they were treated as immigrants became very contentious, as you are aware, a few years ago. There was a Barbadian artist, Sonia Boyce, and I invite the media for you to be able to see her particular portrait in that exhibition of the character, the lady in Desmond's, for those who know that British program from Guyana. And the work that she did was quite exceptional. We were only there on our way to Geneva, and I indicated that we had to attend the Future of Work Summit, which focused on social justice. Barbados is one of the few countries, and not now, going back for decades, that has had consistent representation on the governing body of the International Labour Organization. And I don't think we have to wonder why. We have a strong labour movement in this country. Indeed, I think you will recall on the 100th anniversary of the ILO, I had the honor of unveiling a bus in tribute to Sir Roy Trotman, who served with distinction for many, 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 I almost want to say decades, on that organization's governing body. As we speak today, I think the General Secretary of the Barbados Workers' Union is still a member, and more, in addition to her, Minister Colin Jordan is also on the governing body. So Barbados is represented both at the level of government and at the level of the labour movement. They invited myself and a few other heads to be able to speak, and we felt that if we are going to properly anchor the reform of the international financial architecture, that we have a moral and solemn duty to remind people of where it starts. It starts with people. It starts with the labour movement. And these are the things that have informed our development from day one, and hence the opportunity to be able to address that group, the summit in Geneva. In addition, we have been a little delinquent in not meeting earlier with the UNCTAD Secretariat, United Nations Conference for Trade and Development Secretariat. We are at the point where we're coming up to halfway, and indeed next year we have agreed that as a follow-up to our being president of UNCTAD, that we will host a global supplies chain forum in Barbados in order to allow countries like ourselves, developing countries, to better understand how the supplies chain framework will be reformatted, reshaped in a way that helps us better as countries. I think many of us will recall that in my budget last year, I had to introduce measures to freeze the freight rate to December 20 rates for the purposes of calculating taxes. All of this result of the logistics of trade, and as a result, we felt that there is a need to better deconstruct and reconstruct the global supply chain, particularly given the level of economic activity that is going to be thrust upon the world with respect to green transition. We now know it is inevitable, and you only have to feel the heat this afternoon to know that this notion of convection rain is now a part of our lexicon in this country now, in a way that you would hear people in Miami or Jamaica talk about it before. But it is very real for us, and I'm told that on Monday afternoon there were some storms as well that literally threw themselves up. Took the other opportunity to meet with the World Trade Organization. As you know, coming out of MC12, the ministers' negotiations, the issue of the fisheries subsidies regime is now presently before us. We've all agreed to it, but we've paused for the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, along with the Minister in charge of Fisheries, to start the process of detailed discussions now with the fishermen, so that everyone is aware what is being done and how it will not distract from their interests, but will add value, hopefully, not just to the ability of fishermen to sustain livelihoods, but for us to maintain the biodiversity of the world, which, as we now know, is as important as the actions that we take to protect the climate itself. I then attended the Africa Exim Bank, the 30th anniversary of that institution's existence. And the chairman of CARICOM, the Honorable Philip Davis, Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Honorable Ralph Gonsalves, and myself were the ones there. Barbados has been chosen to be the location, the regional headquarters of the Africa Exim Bank. It is a signal honor for us to be able to host them here. And I believe that we shall be having the formal opening on or about the 4th of August. And that is the date that we're looking at now. They have already chosen an office. They're already looking to see what else they need to do in order to be able to get functional. They have put before this region, without all of the countries coming on board, $1.5 billion US to finance both public and private sector projects. And there is the opportunity for a great deal of technical assistance. The other major benefit that we have worked out, there will be a pilot scheme to be able to facilitate our use of the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System, PAPS, which is a huge, huge benefit if it works. And let me explain why. Many of you may remember the CARICOM Multilateral Clearing Facility. And I say many of you and then maybe change my mind because I now remember how much gray hair I have and how some of us in this room have balded. The truth is that that was in vogue in the early 90s. And you will recall that it came to a stop when one country could not settle its debts with Barbados, which were eventually settled about 7-8 years ago. So it took a long time for it to happen. These payment schemes invariably require some kind of underpinning, backstopping. And the African Exim Bank is prepared to provide that backstopping as they do in Africa at the moment, at this point in time. And that will make a huge difference if it can work. What typically would happen is that you net off each other's trade and then you look to pay just the difference in the hard currency. And the governor of the Central Bank of the Bahamas was responsible for coordinating among the regional governors of the Central Bank what is possible. We've now agreed that we will go into a pilot. And why is this important? Instead of having to find US dollars, everything to do with the region, that netting off. So the absolute amount of US dollars that you need to find will be significantly reduced. This is a major achievement for the region if the pilot works out well. It will be a huge advantage to us, but we must start with the pilot. In addition to that, we also agreed that there would be an attempt to get the other CARICOM countries, and once they come, I think there are only about 2 or 3 missing now, and once they come on board, that 1.5 billion is likely to be significantly increased. And I say this because there are very few regions or entities or institutions that have placed before the Caribbean countries an opportunity to be anchored with the equivalent of 3 billion Barbados, 1.5 billion US. And you can look around and see who has the kind of money at this time. In addition to their participating in the commerce and investment with for those who the CARICOM Development Fund is, when the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas was signed, there was a recognition that a single market and a single economy will bring about losers and will bring about winners. And to be able to level it off, that there would be a CARICOM Development Fund that would deal with, and this was the genius of the solution at the time, and we have to thank the framers for this, that would deal with disadvantaged countries, disadvantaged regions, disadvantaged sectors. And Kerry can speak more at length about this because both in our last incarnation as a government and this current one, he has been on the front line of dealing with these foreign trade issues for us, and can tell you that really and truly, especially with respect to the Eastern Caribbean, but with respect to more developed countries as they're called in the CARICOM lexicon, not that that is the word I want to ascribe to ourselves, but Jamaica, Guyana, Trinidad, Barbados have always been viewed as the MDCs and the others as LDCs. And what has happened is that unless you had a mechanism to level off the development, there would not be the opportunity for everyone to benefit. What the Africa Exim Bank is doing is allowing the CARICOM Development Fund, which is a fund that has been established to be able to provide concessional funding to disadvantaged countries, sectors, and regions. They are allowing them to become a member of the bank, a shareholder of the bank, such that they can look at working together to issue jointly financial instruments that will help sap up some of the excess savings in the market that we have in the Caribbean. I do not have the last figure, but on the last occasion when we had checked about 2 years ago, we had 50 billion US in non-financial sector savings regionally, and about another 50 billion in financial sector savings. That 100 billion US is attracting interest rates at next kin to nothing. And you know what they are, 0.01001%. If we can float an instrument that can give people, as we have done domestically with the BOSS bonds, that can give people regionally 3%, 2.5%, whatever it is, it will be significantly more than they're getting at the moment. But it will also then enable us to on-lend at reduced rates to the disadvantaged countries, the disadvantaged sectors, and the disadvantaged regions. In addition then to leaving, when we left Ghana, we went to the conference of the new Global Financial Pact. And let me salute, I believe that the Nation newspaper had a representative in Ghana that the Africa Exim Bank would have facilitated. And similarly, they had a representative in Paris that the French government would have facilitated as well. President Macron would have announced in November when we met at the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt that there would be a conference that he would be convening on seeing how the world can develop a new global financial pact. And what is really meant by that? We work with the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, which is otherwise part of it known as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, as one particular part of it. It has other components. The World Trade Organization, which was preceded by the GATS, the General Agreement for Tariffs and Trade and Services. But these institutions were all formed after World War II. When Barbados became an independent country, when Jamaica became an independent country, when Ghana became an independent country, when India became an independent country. So all of these institutions were formed before we were even capable of being responsible for our affairs. And therefore what we found is that they do not necessarily reflect our interests and our priorities. And while we could have existed along the way with that, at the very time when the world has multiple crises coming at us, and we call it a polycrisis moment, we need to ensure that we have the capacity to respond accordingly. Telling me that Barbados can build coastal defenses a decade from now, when we need the coastal defenses now, means that we will carry 7 times what it will cost us to invest in the coastal defenses, probably in losses. And there are some losses that are irretrievable. If in this gentleman's constituency, the aquifers and in the rest of the north have the saltwater intrusion, if the salt water goes into those, you know, you can't use them again. That done, lick and lock up, done with. And therefore, you're going to immediately lose that access to the groundwater there. And if you have to go for desalinated water, as the last government committed us to, but we've been able to hold off, they committed an extra 15 million gallons a day, and thus far only 3 was ever brought into existence, because the other 12, there was no institutional capacity, as the Deputy Prime Minister will tell you, to be able to accommodate it. But worse than that, there was no distribution capacity, so that we would end up paying in the contract from day one, top dollar, pay for 6 million from each of the 2 6 million suppliers, but maybe only accommodate 2 million, in which case you're paying for 4 million more than you ever get every day. And as you know, we stopped that when we came in. But we are conscious that desal water will always be more expensive than groundwater. And therefore, whatever we have to do to protect groundwater, particularly when there's a groundwater crisis globally, and I invite the members of the media to start carrying some of these stories. If you see what is going on in Spain now, it will break your heart with respect to the temperatures, but also with respect to the water. I'm not a climate scientist, but when I look at the map of Africa and see the northern part of Africa as a desert, it's no wonder Spain is facing what it is facing with respect to the temperatures and with respect to the lack of access to water. When you fly over North Africa and you see the amount of dry rivers and the barren landscape, you want to cry. Without interruption. The point I'm making is, however, that these international financial institutions have now to ramp up to help us act at scale and in time. You can't do this over 10, 15 years, 20 years. If you don't take action now, there are going to be losers. How many people have gone down to St. Peter in 6 months? You see me carry visitors there all the time from international organizations. Why? On the last occasion, we carried Franz Timmermans there 2 weeks ago. The fishermen themselves, under the shed, told him that there used to be houses all along this beachside in 6 months in St. Peter. I remember it as a child, and I'm sure many of you do. But what he also said is that there was enough space between the houses and where the sea used to break in order to play cricket and without the ball hitting the houses all the time. So what does that tell us? That it is not just the loss of area of the curtilage of the house that has been lost, but all of the other area that has been taken in by coastal erosion. So Barbados, fortunately, has been spending money, for example, on coastal protection for some time. The water scarcity problems, we, in my view, have not spent with the pace and the scale that was required of us for the last 30 years. We have now to catch up. And that's why the Deputy Prime Minister will be leading a team from the Water Authority to the Netherlands next week in order to be able to see where we can get substantive technical support and coordination from the government of the Netherlands and the different universities, because we are at the stage now where science must make a difference and clear strategic planning and the engineering considerations have to come to the fore. In Paris, therefore, what we sought to discuss was how we can change around what is happening in the world. The biggest concrete measure is something that we have been arguing for since December 2018. Barbados is the biggest issuer of commercial paper with natural disaster clauses. You've heard me say so over and over. If, God forbid, a flood or a hurricane hits us at a certain force, we have the capacity to pause the payment of our debt for 2 years, back-end it at the end of what the debt was supposed to be. And in those 2 years, it would unlock the equivalent of about 1.9 billion Barbados dollars, which works out somewhere to be about 15% of GDP probably now. Sean, I haven't done the numbers recently, but 15, 16% of GDP probably. But what we never had in the equation is the multilateral development institutions. because they were like, don't touch us, protected, insulated. And by that I mean the World Bank. The IDB came up with its own craft version of it that wasn't too helpful before. The CDB, all of the different multilateral development banks, regional development banks. It was a huge victory for the new president of the World Bank to be able to announce that going forward, the World Bank will in fact include, they want to call them debt pause clauses or climate resilience clauses. Doesn't matter what you call them. It is the principle that is the same. And I want to thank White Oak publicly. Grenada became the first country in the world to ever have one. Barbados was the first country to do it at scale. And that the rest of the world has now accepted it. And this morning, the British Foreign Secretary would have indicated as well, reinforcing the message from Minister Mitchell in his office, that the British with the UK Export Development will now, agencies will now include what they call, I think the British call it climate resilient debt clauses. The World Bank calls it debt pause clauses. Barbados calls it natural disaster clauses, but they're all the same. In addition to that, we also agreed that there needs to be, first of all, the $100 billion that was pledged so long ago and never delivered, they've now agreed that that $100 billion is there. The difficulty is, and Africa and ourselves reminded them, is that it really was supposed to be $100 billion per year. And therefore, when you hear me talk about scale, pace, scope, that's why. So we're thankful for the $100 billion, but it is nowhere near enough to meet the needs of all of the developing countries and all of the vulnerable middle-income countries. In addition to that, we also, of that $100 billion, pledges for rechanneled SDRs at $60 billion have already been sent, and it's the remaining $40 billion to be collected. But that is a major start because we've been asking for that for over a decade. Okay? With respect to the multilateral development banks, in April of this year when we went to the World Bank's annual meeting, they had agreed that they would sweat their balance sheet and move the loan to equity ratios from 20% to 19%, which would only unlock $5 billion a year, but over a 10-year period, that's $50 billion. We thanked them, but once again, we said it was a little too modest. It is like, give me, I tell you that I'm real hungry, and you give me a bite of a lead pipe to eat and tell me hold that, and you won't even give me the whole lead pipe to eat. You understand? Not enough to even really start to make a dent. We agreed, and we still think it is nowhere near where we need to be, but we are likely to see that figure of $50 billion over the 10 years move to $200 billion a year. And that is what we need to be able to leverage. But to leverage that, you need to have a core amount of capital. So that discussion is still taking place. There has been an improvement, but it is not yet where we need it to be, and we will continue. In addition, we agreed that we have to find money as well as mechanisms to unlock private sector capital. The truth is that most of what has to be done, you know what is going to hit Barbados the worst? When we have consistently 1.5 degrees increase. The world is at 1.2 now. We have seen it hit 1.5 once. When it starts to hit 1.5 consistently, all that we see in here can be like child's play. Last week, when we reached China, on Sunday, it had its hottest day in over 60 years. Now, I believe, they said 72. I believe that they really meant on record, because it's difficult to believe that they had a hotter day 72 years ago. So it probably means like on record. Just as in Barbados' case I shared with you with the water conference and before, that our rainfall for the first 5 months of the year, the 30-year average is normally 280 millimeters. This year it was 149 millimeters. As we speak, there are 80 million people in the United States of America under heat warnings that are literally making, and I believe a few people died already in the last few days as a result of this heat wave. And they expect in the United Kingdom for them to hit record temperatures as well. Bajans who live in New York would have called home and told the family 2 weeks ago, boy, you can't believe the kind of smog that I got up here. That you looking around and the place full, and you can't see nothing, and you got to walk about with a mask like if the pandemic break again. Those were certainly the calls that I started to get. And in Washington, D.C., a few days later, they too suffered the same thing. The New England states suffered the same thing. Why? Because once again, the wildfires on the eastern seaboard in Canada literally were engulfing New York and the eastern seaboard of the United States of America. Your newspapers would have carried a story about the insurance companies agreeing that they are not going to underwrite insurance in California for fires. You beginning to see where this is going? Can you get a loan for a business without insurance? One of the first things that the bank can ask you for when you get a loan with a business is for what? Insurance. So that you begin to understand, and that's why our first meeting in Paris was actually with a group of private sector people at the Bank of America, with the Insurance Association, who's actually led by a Barbadian, Ekoswe, who is George Bell's niece, and has done, she was here with us looking at the issue of insurance 3 years ago before COVID broke out, because we believe that that's going to be the next major issue that will affect the conduct of business in this part of the world. But I'm not going to talk about that this evening. I'm going through all of these things because if ever the world was going through a metamorphosis, it is now. And the question is, can we beat the tape? Can we do enough in time? And that is why, can you imagine if Barbados had not completed its debt restructuring before the pandemic, or even now as we start to deal with these climate crises, as we started to see in 2021, when we went from ashfall, which shut down the port and airport for 7 to 9 days respectively, to freak storm, to Hurricane Elsa, when we're still finishing up the last amount of houses with Hurricane Elsa with people, largely because 90% of the 2,700 or so houses were owned by people below the poverty line, and 95% of those who owned it did not have insurance. And we haven't even started to talk about businesses yet that could be affected in this environment. So what has to happen? We feel that there has to be enough private sector money unleashed in the world in order to be able to keep the world to 1.5 degrees. And what is the magical thing about mitigation? It took me a while to understand what's mitigation, what's adaptation, what's all these fancy words. Adaptation simply mean that you're going to learn to adapt to live in this new reality. It's hot, stop all your men, stop wearing these suits and these long ties and these close-up things, and start to wear some guayaberas and some shirt jacks, which we have already accepted as formal wear in Barbados. That's what adaptation means, okay? That you don't go and waste water, and that if you're building a house, you adapt by doing what? Have a water tank and put the water-saving devices in there, and we'll come to that at another time. Santia is going to lead the effort on that for us. Mitigation means how you stop it from getting worse, how you stop that climate from getting up in there. Well, the beauty of mitigation is that it is no one country that causes it, and it's no one country that has to solve it. Mitigation can take place anywhere in the world. We were listening and reading about the icebergs melting for a while. People were laughing at Al Gore, remember? When he talked about inconvenient truth. But you want the worst part of this, and I'm sorry that Dr. Seeley is not alive with us. Dr. Seeley sat me down one night in New York as we were preparing for a General Assembly speech. I think it was 2021. And he said, Prime Minister, you know when the world was first started to be warned about the climate crisis? And he brought the documents because he sat on the Article 6 negotiations for the longest time. And that's why I said we lost a Trojan when he passed. Since the last decade of the 19th century. But how many of us knew that? And you may ask, why the Prime Minister talking all this for us for the afternoon? What we should feel we need to know all this about? Because if you don't know, you can't hold people to account. And if we had known that the situation was so dread, what we couldn't do in 100 years, we know God do in 10. Lack of knowledge, lack of education. And that's when people is enslave you and when people is take advantage of you. And we are not, as a country, going to let that happen to us, because I've told the members of cabinet, as I will tell the members of the parliamentary party, they have to hit the ground and start to break out these issues for ordinary people. That's why we're doing the Water Academy. That's why we're going to do the water monitors or water cadets, whatever Sandy and them choose to call them, where the children are the ones. And we expect the same thing to happen with the Ministry of Environment, with Minister Ford, with the litter. The children are the ones whose ways must change, because they are the ones who are going to be the biggest victims in the next 20, 30, 40 years in a world that is inhospitable. How many of us watch sci-fi movies and thought that's something for the future? Huh? Artificial intelligence, a machine that take on a life of its own, and you can no longer program it and tell it what to do. Those things were science fiction before, until 300 scientists signed a document a couple months ago saying they are frightened as hell for where it can go. And there's certainly benefits, don't get me wrong, there are benefits that we must embrace. But we have now to look at what kind of regulatory framework, including Barbados, including other countries, that needs to be put in place for us to be able to make sure that we do not put at risk the future of humanity. So coming back to the private sector unlocking, mitigation must happen, whether it happens in Timbuktu or it happens in Bridgetown, whether it happens in California or it happens in Samoa, whether it happens in London or it happens in Argentina. Are we clear? That what matters is just getting the right projects that can stop the level of emissions of greenhouse gases and to be able to contain it. The problem is this. You heard that there was a big announcement in Scotland at Glasgow 2 years ago. Oh, there will be a jet P project in South Africa. South Africans burn a lot of coal because decades of apartheid left them in absolute poverty, and therefore the average person to eat needed food. Grandmother got to go and get the wood to burn the fire to cook. All the countries who can do it and can afford it say, we're going to back South Africa. One problem, the cost of borrowing in South Africa has meant that the project has not been able to get off the ground. And that is largely because the cost of borrowing for the global south countries, former colonies, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Caribbean, that the cost we have to borrow at is significantly higher than what you can borrow at in Europe and North America and UK. And therefore what we've said is that you've got to make the cost of borrowing similar across the board. One of the reasons for the cost of borrowing being higher is a credible, valid reason, and Sean, you can do work and explain this to the country in your publications, foreign exchange guarantees. And Professor Passad and others have done a paper on a partial foreign exchange guarantee, and the IMF is having a different approach to the possibility of foreign exchange guarantees to help reduce the cost of capital. Because what happens when you go to borrow, they typically price in every risk. So what is the risk of you not paying back? What is the risk that when I want to get my foreign exchange out, you tell me I can't get foreign exchange? What is the risk of ABC? And for each risk, same thing with the natural disaster clauses. If we have a climate event, there's a risk of non-payment. By having the natural disaster clauses that frames it in a certain way as to how you will be repaid, that eases the pressure. So this is just another mechanism. Paris was about that too, and we've agreed that we will look at a pooling in order to be, a pilot, sorry, in order to be able to see how we can put these mechanisms in place. And we feel strongly, and Barbados has argued, that even if we can't raise all the money that we need to raise between now and the end of the year, we must go to Dubai at COP28 with a record and not a promise. The world's population cannot take much more promises. They need to know that enough will be done, because this thing is real, and it is claiming lives, and it is claiming livelihoods, and it is doing so at a pace that none of us are comfortable with. We would never have known 5 years ago, when we became the government, that it would have accelerated as quickly as it has been accelerating. And the difficulty with this kind of acceleration, I'm not a scientist, but you would know that if the environment within which animals and life must live changes, then there's the risk of pathogens and all kinds of things that will come to, not true, that were not there before, and hence pandemics. So we agree that the unlocking of this $1.5 trillion for the private sector to do mitigation is critical. The multilateral development banks, what I told you about them, that is primarily to help governments borrow to do adaptation. The only body who would probably benefit, sometimes a small group of the private sector can benefit from adaptation, because if you have a hotel on the beach and the beach gone, you're not going to have any future revenues. So therefore, in many instances, hotels and other coastal establishments have some level of vested interest with respect to that. I apologize for talking this long, but it is important that people understand, and even if you have to break it up into bite-sized chunks for Bajans, remember what I say to you. If you knew that World War III had broken out, you would know what it is, just like how the war in Ukraine broke out. This is effectively World War III on the 8 billion people living on the planet Earth. And if we don't act today to save the planet tomorrow, the ones that will be lost first are small states like ours that have no buffer and no place for people to run. And that is why we could not wait for somebody to carry a brief for us, for somebody to argue for us. If you, there's an old case from the 1960s, and you will forgive me for quoting it, that is called Tepper versus the Queen, T-E-P-E-R. Lawyers will know it. And it was for a hotel that is right there by Thunder Bay, what we call Thunder Bay in Barbados now, right there in Lower Carlton. And the man's hotel was burning, and it is used in the rule against hearsay. And the man was told by one of the residents of Thunder Bay, of Lower Carlton, sorry, Kerry, your place burning, are you running away from it? And of course I was tickled as a student in London reading this in a textbook, because the Bajan was very much captured in the language of the statement that whether this was to be admitted from it into the evidence or not. Your place burning, are you running away from it? We can't get more Bajan than that. The world on fire. I expect us not to be there to try to protect Barbados. The world on fire. Heat-wise, everything-wise. And I can give somebody else a brief to carry where I could go and argue for myself, or send Kerry or Santia or somebody. No. Let me get this straight. We don't send nobody to fight our battles when the whole country is at stake. We go and fight them ourselves. And that is what we have been doing for the last few years. And we have seen others now accept the wisdom and the strength of what we are doing. And I give you the example of Tepper and the Queen to really drive home what our country expects from us. Because when all the long talk finish about travel and this, they can ask you why you didn't do something about it. Why you didn't do something about it. Well, we have done and we continue to do, and I'm not going to tell you it's going to be done in one fell swoop. The truth is that we did not see much movement up until about 9 months ago, when we put the Bridgetown Initiative in a format where people could read and walk and take it and talk. All of a sudden we started to see people's eyes start to open. And we recognize that this is one time you can't take the foot off the accelerator. And we are not yet where we want. We feel that the world is going to have in the World Bank to create an institution that protects global public goods. Why? We're going to have more pandemics, as sure as day follows night. We also have, and I interestingly saw that Madonna has had to put off her concert because of a bacterial infection. The reality is that that will probably do more to let people know what happens when you have infections that cannot be fought against by antibiotics, because the antibiotics are not being as effective as they used to be. And that's why you heard last night on the news them talk about giving a broad spectrum antibiotic so you could start to narrow down which one, if any, could work. I know it well because of people around us who have died in this country, too many. The world must also guarantee, so that's climate and biodiversity loss, pandemics we have to protect against. We have to protect against food and water insecurity. We know because we're a water scarce country, and we need to be able to make sure that people, when all the highfalutin talk done, people need food and water every day. And right now, there are too many people in this world who are being forced to move because they no longer have access to water for farming or water for life. And similarly, if you don't have that, you don't have food. And the other big thing that you haven't heard us talk a lot about, but you're going to hear us talk a lot about, is soils, because you're getting declining yields from produce because the soils are degrading at too fast a pace in the world. And then you have the digital divide. And you've heard us talk. Santia did a yeoman's job in making sure during the pandemic that we got as many tablets to as many Barbadian students as possible. Many countries could not do what Barbados did. And what you have now is a digital divide, on top of the fact that if Africa got 1.4 billion people, how 600 million people ain't got any electricity? And the world has acknowledged and allowed that to happen without intervention. And yet we have people dying every month in boats or trekking across forests to be able to flee from where they live in order to just get a decent chance at a livelihood. And whether we like it or not, we've seen elements of it here too. People try to come in the Caribbean and do the same thing too. So let us understand that the digital divide is real. The old people tell us the worst thing is a bright child that ain't got opportunity, because what they're going to do? The devil finds what? The idle hands. And if they got a brain and the hands idle, they're going to find a way to make a living, because they're human too. Ain't they human too? And that's part and parcel of what we're fighting against. And we say that the World Bank has to be that place. There's not been acceptance of it yet, but people are beginning to recognize that what we're saying has resonance. That the World Bank has to be that place that whether you're big or small, rich or poor, that there's a certain minimum standard that you protect globally. Because what is the motto of the unions, that the labor movement here? Strength is what? Unity. And therefore, unless you have a minimum standard that no country falls below, one country at risk puts the whole world at risk. And that is why the conversation has changed. The other major thing is that it is our judgment that coming out of Paris, while we got a few things done, what we got more than anything else was a bolstering of political ambition and a strengthening of solidarity. Paris was not a pledging conference, so you would not expect people to go to Paris and pledge money. Paris, in the way that they had a pledging conference for Ukraine, for the private sector last week, was not a pledging conference. Paris was also not a formal multilateral body like the United Nations convening, and therefore a multilateral decision would not be taken to bind all. But Paris had more than a third of the world's countries there at the level of heads of government, heads of state, and more than half at ministerial level, probably 2/3 at ministerial level. What Paris did was to let the world know that the global south is not prepared to sit back and wait anymore and to be victims anymore, and that we either get our act together or we will come soon to the reality that nature abhors a vacuum. And that is the genius of it. And President Macron, to his credit, understood that and felt that he had to host a conference to give expression to being able to resolve what are the true needs of finance, and recognizing that if countries don't hurry up and build resilience, if countries don't hurry up and adapt, for every dollar, remember this, for every dollar you spend in adaptation, you can avoid $6 to $7 in loss. Those are World Bank's figures, not mine. But worse than that, you will avoid the loss of life because regrettably, people are dying. When we were in Ghana at the Africa Exim Bank, we met with the president of Malawi, and he indicated that Malawi has had to move 500,000 people because of drought. But Malawi was also the country this year that was hit by the longest lasting cyclone in the history, Cyclone Freddy. So can you imagine having to face both the movement of people and that all at the same time? We then went to China, where in addition to being one of the opening speakers at the World Economic Forum, what is known as the Summer Davos, there were a number of matters on an official visit that I was able to discuss with the Chinese government. We had the honor of meeting with the leadership of the Chinese government across the board. Indeed, they made it clear Barbados was the first Eastern Caribbean country, the first Caribbean country to visit since the pandemic. And they were very happy to have us there and to engage with them. The pandemic truly interrupted a planned visit to China. As you would recall, President Xi and I had a conference call which we made public back in July of 2021. And we have valued our relationship with China. This is its 46th year that we have diplomatic relations. Barbados and a few Caribbean countries, Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, were among some of the earliest countries globally to establish relations with China when it was not popular to do so. And China has been a good friend to Barbados, as you know, throughout the years. We were able to discuss many things, both at the bilateral and the multilateral level. As you can see, there are a number of things that we want to be discussing as innovative financial instruments. I haven't given you the full brief out of Paris because that would take another half hour. But we discussed, for example, not just foreign exchange guarantees, debt for climate swaps. Barbados, as you know, became one of the first countries to issue a debt for nature swap last year when we did the blue bonds, where we took our debt and just by reducing the interest rate, got others to agree that that reduction in interest rates would go to fund a maritime conservation trust that over 15 years would bring us somewhere between 50 to 60 million US, depending on the movement of interest rates. We want to do a debt for climate swap now, which is different from debt for nature, but I'll discuss that in the future with you as we give more texture to it. And we are discussing that with a number of countries now. But in China, we were therefore able to have discussions at the multilateral level, but also in terms of our work together multilaterally, but also to discuss at the bilateral level continued cooperation in healthcare. Many of you may not know that China has been sending a delegation of doctors here who have been working at the QEH for some time. We want to continue that, as well as expanded financing of our healthcare facilities in Barbados. I think I mentioned that to you a couple of weeks ago, both in terms of the QEH and the Randall Phillips Polyclinic and Eunice Gibson Polyclinic. Secondly, we discussed cooperation in transport. We discussed cooperation in food security and agriculture. And at the appropriate times, we will be advising you of the specific initiatives as they are given expression to. We also spoke about cooperation on the blue economy in particular. I gave a lecture at the Chinese University for Political Science and Law, and I've agreed in principle with them that I would speak now to the University of the West Indies for a platform for cooperation on maritime law, law of the sea, which, as you know, is critical for us as a large ocean state. And I expect to see evidence of the strengthening of that relationship and the solidarity as we go forward in major ways in the next few months. We discussed the existing projects that we have, the Compliant project with the Scotland District Road Rehabilitation, which is had a few hiccups, but is now proceeding apace, as the DPM would tell you. We discussed, in addition to that, other cooperation with respect to the stadium, and I know that you would want me to show you what it is we expect from the stadium. It has obviously gone in. The design has had significant thought, and that is effectively what the new stadium will look like. They took the, can't you just help me here so I can turn the pages, please? They took the design of the trajectory of the flying fish, and you'll see that soon somewhere. They make sure that it aligns with our mission economy. And they took a seashell. So between the flying fish and the seashell, you will note, see the shape of the roof, and you will note that the seashell as well is also reflected in that. And they also looked at the use of arch colonnade in the Parliament and the other buildings in the World Heritage District of Bridgetown, the Pavilion Court, as you know, and Parliament, and tried to incorporate that in. This particular phase 1 will be 10,000 seats, which is significantly more than anything that we've had at the mic, sorry. Yeah, significantly more than anything that we've had at the stadium before. I think the stadium before, you only used to seat about 4,500, 5,000 people. So we're more than doubling it. But I've asked for those who continue after me, or for if there's growth sufficiently in the next few years, for us to also look, even though we're not building that second part now, what a phase 2 would look like if we built a second stand on the other side of the stadium, in order to be able to also help with blocking the wind, but also to accommodate a similar 10,000 or a proportionate number there too. And without prejudice to the start of this work, they will also do that investigation for us, which is why it was important to have the discussions with the architects and all of the designs and engineers. And I look forward to this project happening. Barbados has long needed a national stadium. The discussion for it took place from when last we were in government. It went through 10 years of the last government, and then we were ready initially with the Chinese, in fairness. Up to 2019, we started to have the discussions, and then bam, COVID came. And as you know, China shut down from the rest of the world until basically they were the last really to open back up. And I'm happy now that we can move full steam ahead. The different studies and assessments are being done. The gap analysis is going to be done now by town planning. Once the formal goes in, I believe, in the next few days, and once that gap analysis is done and we see what needs to be done, we complete any studies, and then we start the work of construction on a new national stadium. And this, as you know, is a grant to the people of Barbados that we've negotiated. It is not a loan, and this is substantively appreciated, because why? We are also financing so many other different things that are crises that we have to deal with, and therefore it would have been difficult. We could have done it, but it would be difficult to do it. And we therefore are grateful to the government and people of China for agreeing that this is to be a major gift to the people and government of Barbados. As I said, there are a number of other matters. You signed 4 or 5 agreements that were signed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Government Information Service can release that information to you. And those agreements range from development cooperation to blue economy to cooperation with the Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation. We anticipate that there will be substantive improvements there. We also had major discussions around transport. As you know, we are already the user of electric buses, the largest number of electric buses in the region, both in absolute numbers at the moment, as well as a percentage of our rolling stock. And the Chinese minister, vice minister in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will be joining us in Trinidad next week as we go to heads for the 50th anniversary of the Caribbean community. That is perhaps an opportune time for me now to go to the last matter that I wanted to discuss with you. 50 years ago, leaders of the region of the Caribbean community with a vision agreed to establish this Caribbean community, otherwise known as CARICOM. In our own case, we give thanks, just as we have done before, to the Right Excellent Errol Barrow for being the person who led on this particular instance. Before him, there was Sir Grantley Adams, who is the only Prime Minister of the West Indies Federation. The region next week will host a number of guests while taking a number of decisions and fundamentally looking at ourselves as a community of 50 years. We also agreed when we met in Nassau earlier this year that we would find a tangible way to allow the people of the region to also be able to celebrate the 50th anniversary. And to that extent, you will recall that Mr. Barrow's speech, and those who have never read it should go and read it, in 1986 to the heads of government as they were meeting in Georgetown, was to give expression to the fact that the regional integration movement is really a lived reality of all of us. And even in this room, I can look around and show how it is a lived reality for the people of this region. The truth is that while the heads are therefore meeting next week, different countries will choose to honor that obligation that we gave in the Bahamas in a different way. The actual agreement for the community was signed on the 1st of August, 1973. And we have today as a cabinet chosen, and we have consulted with the social partnership and indicated our preference to them, that as a one-off, that Barbados will celebrate 50 years of the Caribbean community on the 31st of July as a national public holiday on the eve of the 1st of August, which remains still sacrosanct for us as a former slave society as Emancipation Day. And to that extent, therefore, we felt that to do it on July 4th would have been a little too early. I expect a bumper crop over season, and I expect that those who saw a barren period for the last few years in terms of those who would normally make their living at crop over, I trust and pray that they will do the dog. Excuse me. But that's how I feel. And we felt that this would be a better fit for them, for the country, for all of us, the private sector, all of us, because as you know, events have a way of spawning spending as well in the economy. And it has not escaped us that from every which way we look at it as a government, that the best time to allow our appreciation for the visionary leadership of those who went before to make a difference, to establish the Caribbean community, that we do it then. And for those who say, well, what would that mean to us? Let me be very clear here. Barbados, more than most others, have benefited from a single market and a single economy. Trinidad benefited from a CARIFTA, a trade in goods. Kerry would tell you and give you a lecture on it. But we started to benefit when you could start to freely move services. So cameramen, pool technicians, lab technicians, fellas that do the safes for the banks. You only got to go on any flight down to the Eastern Caribbean and see on a daily basis who traveling. And the number of Bajans who travel to go down and supply services that cannot otherwise be accessed in those countries without having the harassment of having to get complex documents and processes filled in will make you know, do not take the Caribbean community for granted. And for those in Britain, for example, who took the EU single market for granted, many of them are now crying and wishing that they were still in the single market and single economy, because all of a sudden the trucks can't move freely anymore. The goods can't move freely anymore. All of a sudden you can't register and provide services or go and work in countries as you were able to do. So that, believe you me, and I wish, go back and listen to every speech that Wayne Arthur made on this. Go back and listen to Errol Barr and Tom Adams. Go back and listen to the same Sir Lloyd, who was the person who was signatory to the Grand Aunt's Declaration, which effectively laid the framework for the amendment of the Treaty of Chaguaramas, which is where we talk about the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. Go and talk to any of them. All can be wrong. And you understand the critical importance of federation, integration to Barbados. We are too small. And while that gives us access to a larger market, that is still not sufficient. So my friends, I have spoken at length, but I felt I had a duty to do so because, as Kerry would tell you, this has been an arduous trip. Yes, we are very tired, and we have parish speaks tonight, but such is life in the tropics. And it is very hot. But the bottom line is that we wanted to bring Barbadians up to speed on a number of issues related to what transpired there. I also want, before closing, to just make one statement on this, and I'm not going to get into a lot of long talk about it, because there is a desire on the part of people to use fake news to propagate actions and movements. There is no plan. There has never been any plan, and there will be no plan under my leadership for any gender-inclusive bathrooms or for discussions of gender fluidity in the schools. And we need to be able to stop this distraction by those who have a different agenda and who want to create a construct in order to knock it down. And I've said so already, and I say so now formally as Prime Minister and Chair of the Cabinet, which just finished again. And let us be very clear on this, because these distractions are out of place. We have made it clear as a government that we will not support discrimination against Bajans. And that is why a time will come shortly where we remove that discriminatory part. The court has already taken a decision. They went too far in the judgment of the Attorney General, and we await his formal opinion for how he will correct it with respect to any act against children under the age of 16. But we will speak to that at another time, and therefore I simply just tell you that what was being propagated as a reality has never been, is not, and under my leadership will not be. But we will defend the rights of people as adults not to be discriminated against in this country. And we've said so over and over. So thank you, and I'm available, as are all of us. Kerry, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, no, I should add it.
And I want to thank Santia and Wilfred for the excellent work which was done with respect to the preparations for Tropical Storm Brett. I heard that there were some people who decided that they needed to make a big deal about my statement, that it really gave me a difficult moment as to what to do. You want to come home when there's trouble, but equally you want to fish, not just be given a fish. For those who haven't understood what I just said, let me repeat. This is now part of our new reality. And we're going to have to reach the point where we prepare for storms at the beginning of the season. Don't be rushing to the supermarket to buy batteries, or to buy candles, or the most you could be looking for is some fresh bread to hold you for 2-3 days because you should have had the biscuits already. Huh? Let me get straight. Let me get straight. You can't be doing it because at this rate, look for a few storms this summer. And if you listen to the weather people, they tell look for it down into early December and look for it starting up in May. So that it really only means that there are 3 months, 4 months of the year, 4 months, January, February, March, April, and then you got other problems called dry weather. So that we are living in a climate crisis truly. And I'm asking every Bajan household, nobody can prepare for you like you prepare for yourself. Prepare for yourself. And recognize that on the day, we have to learn to shut down the amount of time, to minimize the amount of time that we lose. Because if not, you're going to be turning from pillar to post all the time. And on the day itself, it should just be a case of how soon we shut down, how safely we shut down, how long we need to get people to be able to move them from work to home or school to home or whatever. But the lesson also is the freak storm. The freak storm could have come in the middle of the day. It could have come at 2 o'clock in the morning instead of midnight. And we know now that we are vulnerable to systems literally developing offshore in no time at all. When the freak storm happened, we lost about 25 roofs, not true? And about over 100 and something houses were damaged. So I want us to apply our hearts to wisdom, apply our hearts to common sense, and to recognize that we need to be our brother's keeper. And if you know your neighbor ain't got what they need, know that you're going to have help carry them along for the first few days. And let's buy for that. Because at the end of the day, you might have to give them the food, but if something fall on you in your house, they might have to lift the thing off of you to get you out to the hospital. So don't get tired. Let us understand that each of us has a role to play with each other, and we need to talk each other through this because it's a new reality. It is a new reality. So thank you, Santia. Thank you, Wilfred. Believe you me, Kerry will tell you that it hurt our hearts. We were checking all the time because you don't feel good. You don't feel good. But equally, we knew that what matters to us is that we also need to be able to have the elbow room and the pipeline in order to be able to protect ourselves because worse is going to come to the world. Any questions? Thank you. You're going to need the mic for others to hear.
Yes, Madam Prime Minister, I wanted to get a clarification on the July celebration that we're planning.
Mm-hmm.
We were supposed to be choosing something that we'll be doing, Barbados, that is each country in CARICOM.
Yeah, each country.
So what is it that Barbados will be doing?
On that day, we will announce all of the things. There will be a concert on the night of July 31st. What we didn't want to do was to offset anyone who was already announced something, and therefore I have paused and asked the Ministry of Culture to advise us as to what else there is on that day. But Barbados will have a regional CARICOM celebration on the night of July 31st. In addition to that, I've asked them to have CBC, and I will ask the other media houses to start to have each weekend during the month of July something that will reinforce and reflect moments of the last 50 years in the integration movement. And as you heard me talk about the different prime ministers that have been involved along the way, the truth is that every single prime minister of Barbados has been involved in the integration movement, some way, form or fashion, over the last 50 years. Brice St. John was not there for long as prime minister, but he was Minister of Trade and CARICOM Affairs under Tom Adams, and therefore played a significant role in the building out of the Caribbean community. David Thompson was not there for long, but David was a Caribbean man through and through. And therefore, it is fair to say that every single prime minister, the current prime minister, somebody who I think you might know, has been a Caribbean woman through and through. The last prime minister, Frandel Stewart, also. So all of us have played a role. as lead Prime Minister with respect to the single market and single economy in the last 30 years. But before that, before the Grand Aunt's declaration that Sir Lloyd would have signed, there were also critical aspects of the integration movement that Barbados was involved in and pushing.
I have a question as it relates to the multilateral development decision that was taken recently in Paris with the World Bank.
Mhm.
Could you give us an idea of what mechanism you are currently exploring in terms of the pause and how you will pay? Because some argue that it's just delaying the event. So will it be that we are looking at different...
But that's what a pause is. A pause in an erosion. Look, what it is net present value neutral. Because why? If you have $100 today, Marlon, $100 today is not worth the same thing as $100 20 years from now or 15 years from now. But in any event, the most important thing is this. You see how we ain't get hit by a large hurricane and how much we had to do for Elsa and the freak storm. Imagine when we really get hit. Imagine how many Bajans who live in what I call the flat roof houses that we built after Hurricane Janet. And I keep making, there's a reason why them old time gable roofs don't blow off, you know, or the hip roofs don't blow off. But we went after Hurricane Janet and start building these houses with flat roofs that is peel off like sweetie paper. And my biggest fear, that's why the government has a project called Roofs to Reefs. That's why we're giving out and for the people who can't afford it and lending for the people who can, to get people to put the hurricane straps on or to get and don't build with this large overhang. And we will soon be appointing a special advisor on infrastructural affairs, not because I want another special advisor for the people to talk about, but because we actually need to revisit all of the standards in Santia's ministry, Public Works, the shape and slope of almost everything you do to be able to deal with increased precipitation, increased rainfall in short periods of time. We need to do it with housing. We need to do it with all of our infrastructure for it to become climate resilient. And mercifully, we don't have to pay for that because we are likely to get grant funding from CAF, grant funding from CAF, in order to be able to get this going. Just as with the Bridgetown initiative, we have had grant funding from a number of agencies to help put together the secretariat of the small secretariat that we have for the Bridgetown initiative. So there will have to be some changes. Any more questions? Sean? This heat not easing up.
Thanks, Prime Minister. Forgive me if this information is out there already and I forgot it, but can you give us a sense of how much the grant from China for the National Stadium is and also what sort of timeline is there in terms of the start of that first phase?
It was about 40 million, huh? 40 million Barbados. It was about 40 million Barbados, but give or take, because remember when we are settled on the grant amount, these designs were not in. So I don't want to give you a finite figure until they have these designs fully completed. As I indicated, the application is going in the next few days, and then the gap analysis as to the studies has to be done because, for example, they just finished a whole host of studies on the other side of Waterford Boulevard for the geriatric hospital, some of which may be applicable to there. And we expect that we would know in a few weeks' time what number of studies would have to be done, but I am hopeful that we can break ground in the next few months and that obviously the country needs it. And phase 2A, phase 2, when it is done, may require a slight realignment of the road, starting from like where the lumber company is, going to Commermere. But this current phase 1 does not require any of that, okay? And therefore, I've asked the Chinese to identify for me what land space would be required so that for future planning, or if I received a bounty and we decided to go with it one time, that we could do it and give the country. The last stadium is in excess of 50 years. I would expect at least 50 to 75 years, if not longer. And that's what we're building for.
Last question. You mentioned the arduous nature of your overseas engagements, but you all know that you have been doing this for quite a while now. Even before the Bridgetown Initiative was designed. You also mentioned the US $100 billion that many saw as a broken promise. The fact that it didn't come through, essentially. What have you seen now in Paris and other places on this last trip that gives you the confidence
That things will change.
that, yes, that you're seeing the difference?
9 months ago, we did not have, first and foremost, the solidarity coming across the South, the global South. I want you to go and listen to the comments, especially in the closing ceremony. Everybody has listened to the opening ceremony. But something special happened in Paris on the night of the first day and the morning of the second day. And the level of solidarity in the global South was palpable. Ironically, Nelson Mandela's wife reached out to me the day after and again today, thanking us for our role in helping to lead this effort of bolstering political ambition and strengthening solidarity. Now that's important because the precepts of divide and rule is what led countries to be successful in dominating the globe for centuries. There is a view that enough is enough and that we need to be able to change what we are doing. There's an article by Jeffrey Sachs that I would commend you to read and share as well, which shows that the truth is that the majority of the world is now getting it. 9 months ago, I would say that I was not as confident that the penny was beginning to drop. The problem that we have is a domestic political problem and a geopolitical problem. And I think that in my wrap-up, and certainly in the session that I did in the middle, I spoke to the obstacles of geopolitics and domestic politics. The United States government has a difficult situation, and one, I empathize with President Biden, Secretary Yellen on, but it is still something that needs to be addressed. And that is that their Congress is deeply, deeply, deeply divided. And they have not been able to get consensus or action on a number of things. Regrettably, it will affect us because let us take the IMF. The United States of America has 17% of the shares, the quota in the IMF. And what is needed to effect change is 85%, which means that they have a right of veto on how and what SDRs should be, if you should reallocate. You heard the UN Secretary General very, very clear, very, very strong, repeating what we have said over and over. When I say we, I mean not just Barbados, I mean the global South. That it is not fair for you to have SDRs, special drawing rights, issued in a crisis, and that the majority of it appears to go to the ones least needing it. Now, there are arguments that will say why some of them need to have, strong countries need to have it in order to balance out the system. But there are other things that need to change. We need the recapitalization of the World Bank. In all the years, Sean, go and check the facts. They've only ever had capital of 22 billion, which has leveraged and unlocked over 80 billion going forward. But we need a proper capital raising of the World Bank in order to strengthen the balance sheet so that they can lend at scale and with pace to others. So we were not getting ambition on the scale of the problem and the scale of the solution. We are now getting a recognition of that. We were not getting recognition of the need for countries to have elbow room when a crisis hit. When Dominica got hit by Irma and Maria, Dominica had to turn around and look for money to pay the World Bank almost immediately. Them things can't be fair, because you trying to find money to be able to feed people and to be able to get enough cots, I can't even say houses, cots and tarpaulins, to be able to make sure that people don't sleep in the rain. And remember, Maria came after Irma, so another storm could always be on your brain. But you're going to look for money to pay debt to an institution that don't need the money tomorrow. There has been change on that. We have seen change as well on the fact that the private sector has to be brought to the table. And in Paris, I made another call that we actually sit down around the table and talk. Sounds a little simple, no? But it is necessary, and it has not happened because nobody has brought oil and gas people, financial people, insurance people, transport people to the table and say, let us talk. There is a recognition that the shipping sector contributes significantly to greenhouse gas emission, but does not contribute any money whatsoever to mitigation or to adaptation. And to that extent, the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, is meeting next week as we speak. There will be a proposal probably for a small shipping tax, carbon tax. But as small states, we've said we understand why you need to do it because share the burden, share the bounty. But we have insisted that that be capped so it does not have an extraordinary impact on inflation with the movement of goods. But you can't have anybody who is profiting greatly while contributing to the gases, the greenhouse gases being emitted, and not contributing to the solution. We have a very simple approach as Bajans. Just as the share the burden, share the bounty, what is the approach? If you help cause the problem, put a few cents on the table. Nobody wants to bankrupt you, but you put a few cents on the table. And if you help, and you benefiting from the problem egregiously, in other words, you're getting a rate of return in excess of 30% on your capital, put a few cents on the table as well to make sure, because the truth is that while we will continue to hold countries accountable who cause the problem, the developed world mainly, we have to recognize that there are many companies whose balance sheets, multinational companies, are way in excess of countries' balance sheets. And that therefore you cannot solve the problem by leaving them out of the room. And Barbados has made the call for them to be at the table with the president of COP28, but with the UN framework, UNFCCC, which is headed by a former Grenadian minister, by the way, Simon Steele. And we feel that that meeting is urgent. In the closing ceremony, I said that it needs to happen in the next 4 to 8 weeks. And I'm writing the president of COP28 and the UNFCCC chairman to ask them to use their good offices to bring it about. This thing is real, huh? Don't get tapped. This is real. I've not gone to any part of the world where I have not seen the consequences of it. And the problem is that the rate at which it is happening is blinding. And that's what is frightening. You know, you had in Wyoming in December temperatures that come within 30 degrees of Mars. Them things ain't supposed to happen on this earth. Okay? So I need us to protect ourselves and to ensure that we don't have to depend on another country for us to become migrants to it. Yes, ma'am.
Prime Minister, since you're on the topic of climate change, I want to look at our current water situation. We were on a prohibition. It's nearing the end of that. And you spoke to being able to do the dog for crop over. We all know how Kadooment there is BWA water stations. What is likely to happen going forward with the prohibition?
I can't imagine, Sandy, that one day will kill you. And in these matters, mental health is as important as physical health, but I'll let Santia speak.
I think before we leave for Netherlands, certainly tomorrow, we will be able to update the country on whether the prohibition will continue. But the truth is that we have not certainly seen a significant increase in the water levels. Don't let the last few days fool you into believing that because we've had consistent rain for very short periods, that has made its way to the aquifers. It will take a long time to make its way to the aquifers. So you can listen out tomorrow, but I anticipate that the way we'll advise that we will continue the prohibition as well for the next few months.
And this final one is for you, Prime Minister. In terms of the stadium, how will renewable technology and green innovation factor in?
I was so excited when I saw some of the images here that it caused me to believe that they were showing us a picture not just of the botanical garden, but that I believe that I now have as MP to go and make sure that that part of Bush Hall that is back in the stadium will now also spring up more breadfruit trees and more trees, because the beautiful thing about Bush Hall is that you do have a significant amount of trees still, and you don't realize that until you see a drone or something going over it. But we will be taking into account greening and renewable energy as a fundamental part of what we're doing. Okay? You can take pictures of this and go through the book at your leisure at the end of the session, and you will see this is a lot of work has gone into it, connected to municipal power supply, connected to telecommunications, connected to water supply, the site access, the main entrance. They're repositioning the stadium a little bit. We have a way of expecting everything like that. I keep telling you that for those who used to watch Bewitched, that you can't trigger your nose and get it. And as I said, this is the kind of great work: lawn rail water infiltration, roof rainwater collection and utilization, street light photovoltaic panel, roof photovoltaic panel, charging posts for new energy cars. There will have to be a new parking arrangements put in place for both the botanical gardens and the stadium. And Santio, once again, along with William Duguid, they're working on a location for multi-story car parking that will be available for those two sites, but also for ultimately any transport arrangements that have to be made for Bridgetown or for Kensington Oval or wherever where park and ride is needed. So the whole thing is integrated. And bear with us, we're going to get there. We're going to make this country the best place to live, I'm telling you. Trust me. But it takes time, and it takes the effort of all of us. Yes, Marlon? Are you letting your thought now? Because when I go to St. George, I'm supposed to be in St. George soon. Oh, from Santio. No problem.
The trip to the Netherlands is going to comprise largely members of the Barbados Water Authority team. We have the chairman, the deputy chair, a number of the technical persons as well, Dr. Mwanza, Charles Leslie, the engineers, and myself, of course. We've also added the chairman of National Housing, along with the civil engineer in that department as well. Now, Prime Minister has opened up a lot of doors for us in the last few years, and the Netherlands is another one that within recent weeks she has had the opportunity to speak with the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and in particular Delft University. And so we have had preliminary discussions which then led to deeper discussions to try to figure out how can the Netherlands, who is well known for being able to, it's the best in the world in terms of being able to do a lot in terms of water resources. As a consequence, we've taken the opportunity to meet with a number of players there in the sector. So the university has been scheduling a number of meetings with us so that we can speak to a number of the operators. Out of this, we are hoping to be able to get a number of best practices for the Barbados Water Authority. We have to transform the Barbados Water Authority, and I think the best place to start is with one of the entities across the world and the countries across the world that is known for doing this at a particular standard. As PM says, we don't have the luxury of time on our hands, and we have to accelerate the process in terms of raising the bar for the Barbados Water Authority. And so we have to definitely go to where the countries are that have those best practices. So this delegation is also looking to be able to find some technical experts who can complement the existing staff of the Barbados Water Authority. Prime Minister said we need to get at least 2 persons to come back with us. I'm hoping that we can get more, because the reality is in any transition, you're going to need the additional hands to help make the light work. And while we have some skills within the BWA, they are often the same people who are being tasked with doing the same things. And therefore, we have to obviously strengthen the human resource capacity within the department. So we will update both while we're there, and I think when we return, hopefully to be able to give some positive feedback as to what the outcomes are for the Barbados Water Authority and certainly for Barbados generally.
Thank you. There are 2 points I just want to make, and you know, Santia made it there, and I feel a need to remind Barbadians. The first 19 months of this government was caught up in debt restructuring. Domestic finished in end of November, December 2018, and the external finished in December 2019. Then we had almost 3 years of COVID. Don't get that. Almost 3 years of COVID where extraordinary and different spending had to take place. And the things that we wanted to do normally, from the same trip to China, right back through, all of those things got put off. The restructuring of the Water Authority, which could not collect revenue from Barbadian households where people were not working, and the Water Authority had to carry people for 3 years in this country. We have really only had the last 10 months with, and I wouldn't call this global environment a free hand, but with a semi-free hand in these last 10 months. And that is why you see us working with such pace now to be able to get as much done, because the truth is that things are still unfolding globally as we speak. We didn't expect a war in Ukraine to throw in there a spanner in the works with respect to oil prices. And as you know, and I'm going to speak to this now because we are fighting the battle. There is a Petro-Caribe agreement that will offer the country. The first one didn't work for us. This one puts available to us a 35% discount. But the Americans continue to have sanctions in place for trade with Venezuela, while Chevron trades with Venezuela. And while the EU have also been given, like Chevron, an exception. And we need to look at the system and see what is the available space for exceptions. We've said it, Trinidad has also said it with respect to other things, with respect to doing work with gas with Venezuela. And these are some of the things that we are going to have to be discussing next week. Recently, Barbados would have had 2 ministerial delegations to Venezuela, both in terms of energy and agriculture. As Santia was pointing out with the Netherlands is not only a global expert on water management, but it is also one of the largest exporters of food in the world. And with the limited land space, relatively speaking, and with difficulties with water, that they have achieved that is nothing short of miraculous if you believed in miracles. But if you understood science and technology, you would understand that it was a careful planning and careful use of science and technology to put them where they are with respect to water and agricultural production. The truth is, we could also look at Israel too, but it just so happened that our relationship is with the Kingdom of Netherlands, and that is whom I hope. We would have liked them to have been there 2 years ago, 3 years ago, but obviously the pandemic would have averted that, but better late than never. Anything else before we wrap up? It's good to see you all again. Okay? I meant that more in terms of the fact that this Zoom press conferences, trust me, they like them. They like them. The fact that we can be in the same space is a blessing, just as I hope that crop over will be that blessing that truly all of us are looking for, that mental release. And for those who have not started to listen to the music is excellent for the most part. They got some lyrics that I really can't understand, and I can say so as a woman, because I do not feel that you need to denigrate women to the extent to which they're being denigrated to have a good time. And anybody who got a mother or who got a sister or who got a daughter that they love will recognize that. Who is the most popular artist in the world from the Caribbean? Who was the most popular artist the Caribbean ever produced? Singing Caribbean music. Bob Marley. Bob Marley. You ever hear Bob talk with a woman yet? Bad? All right. Matter fixed, matter done. Thank you. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you to the members of the Cabinet all for that briefing, that update on those critical advancements the country continues to make. I'd like to thank the members of the public and members of the media for joining us this afternoon, and I'd like to wish everyone a safe evening. Thank you.